We'll say good evening to all of you and welcome to our lecture tonight. We are coming to you live from the RAS office in Jongno-Oga in Seoul. I'm joined here in the office by Joanne Hong, our program coordinator, and also by our lecturer, Robert Neff. He's here with us too. On behalf of Brother Anthony, our president, and the council, I welcome you to the 1429th lecture since we began 120 years ago. The Royal Asiatic Society traces its beginnings to India in the late 1700s and was formally organized in London in the early 1800s. The Royal Asiatic Society of Great Britain and Ireland granted a charter to the Korea branch in 1900, which was the 4th year of the Kangwon Emperor of Korea. RAS expresses our sincere thanks to our generous sponsor, the Asia Development Foundation, for their 2nd year of support. We also thank our members who have paid their annual dues. Your dues provide essential primary funding for RAS Korea, and we appreciate your support. Those in attendance tonight who are not yet paid members are invited to consider joining and becoming a member. See our website at raskb.com for details. For those who are visiting tonight, we suggest a one-time donation of 10,000 won or $10. Full-time students may contribute $5 or 5,000 won. The donation page is up on your screen. You should be able to see the information about how to make those donations. We are delighted to have Robert Neff with us tonight. Robert has lived in Korea for many years and is a columnist for the Korea Times. His history articles appear 2 or 3 times a week, and he's probably one of the most prolific columnists the Times has ever had. Korea has been called the most haunted place on earth. Robert tells us ghosts haunt every tree, shady ravine, spring, and mountain crest, green hill slopes and peaceful agricultural valleys and grassy dells, on wooded uplands by lake and stream, by road and river, in north, south, east, and west. They abound, making malignant sport out of human destinies. They are on every roof, ceiling, oven, and beam. They fill the chimney, the shed, the living room, the kitchen. They're on every shelf and in every jar. They are numbered by thousands of billions, and it has been well said that their ubiquity is an unholy travesty of divine omnipresence. After Robert's lecture, there will be time for questions. Now, if you will please mute your mics and turn off your videos if you're eating chicken, we will turn the time over to Robert. I got to make sure we're recording. I failed to do that. No, we're okay. It is? Yeah. Okay. So this sign means recording. Okay, thank you. All right, Robert, take the chair and
I have the power.
You have the power. You'll need to stop sharing that screen and then share your
PowerPoint.
The PowerPoint share screen. Where did it go?
Right
here. Is
Oh,
that it?
okay.
Yeah. And then figure out which one's your PowerPoint. Click on it, and then we should be able to go. There we go.
Oh,
okay.
Well,
scroll it back. You'll be fine.
Greetings all. This is my first time on Zoom, so I have no idea what I'm doing. And though that actually wasn't my words about the omnipotent ghost everywhere, that was actually George Heber Jones. Let me see if I can find. All right, hopefully this is going. I didn't know Korea was the most haunted place in the world. I got here in Korea in the mid 80s, and I was stationed in Wonju, Kangwon Doe. It was my first time overseas, other than Canada and Mexico. But Wonju to me at that time was mystical. This picture here, I'm not quite sure it's in Wonju, but it was a mystical place where in the mornings when I would get up and run, go out off base and run out in the countryside, I could hear the temple bells, and it seemed like it was stepping back in time. And Wonju was also abundant with potatoes, lots and lots of potatoes. In fact, some of the best potatoes from Korea, I think, are from Wonju. But Wonju also had another thing that was abundant of: corn. And it was corn that I first learned about Korean ghost stories and Korean legends and urban myths. Most of my friends at the time, I was, I think, 19 or 20. Most of my friends were Korean high school or first or second year university. And one of my friends' grandmothers liked me. And one day she gave me a small packet of gochugaru, the dried hot pepper. And I asked my Korean friend, why is she giving me this? And he told me through, or she told me through him, that when she was little, they used to give small children these little packets to prevent them from being grabbed by people with leprosy. It was believed at that time that if you had leprosy, nabyang, you could be cured if you ate the liver of small children. And so I guess children in Wonju, and I heard other places, used to carry these little packets. To me, now that seems kind of ironic, because in the 1890s, people used to carry packets of gochujang, gochugaru, feedback everywhere, gochugaru, because there was a ghost in downtown Seoul that they said had a white face, yellow hair, and blue eyes, with red lips, and cried in a child's voice. And he used to molest the Korean women. And so Korean women would carry this gochugaru, this red pepper, and throw it in the eyes of this ghost, and then be able to get away from it. To me, that sounds more like the baby riots of 1888, but I don't know. Baby, for those who don't know, the baby riots supposedly were caused by missionaries using children in immoral ways, and photographers taking the children's eyes to use them to develop their film. And even the American minister to Korea was supposedly eating children in the American legation. But that was my first experience with the Korean legends. Another thing that Wonju had a lot of were soldiers. And this is me, this is my first Halloween in Korea, out on top of a mountain. And there are, from what I'm told, there are two things that Korean women really, really hate. One, they hate to hear about soccer. And I've heard this from Korean men and women, but women hate to hear men talk about soccer. The second thing, they hate to hear men talk about their military career. And one of my friends recently told me there's a third thing. It's even worse than the previous two. Men talking about playing soccer while in the military. I guess that's the worst. But the military has a big role in men's lives, especially Korean men's life. And it's really hard to explain what it's like unless you have done it. To be out on a guard post late at night, complete darkness, maybe by yourself or with somebody else, and especially along the DMZ where you have the wires and tin cans with little stones in it, and the wind moves them. And you're not sure whether it's the wind or whether it's somebody coming over the wire, or whether it's something else. I have up here Private Kim, roving guard. One of the stories I heard from a soldier was a guy named Kim. And he remembered being in the military. I'm not quite sure where he was at, but it was a forward division, I think. And he had roving guard at night near one of the checkpoints. And I heard, I'm sorry, this wasn't Kim, it was Kim's friend. And he had this roving guard near the checkpoint along the perimeter fence. And supposedly there was a leper in the area that had been preying upon small children. The rumors circulating about it. And so he was really, really nervous. And he heard something out on the perimeter fence. And when he went to investigate, there was a small child looking at him. And the child had like a blue glow around him. He challenged the child. I don't know why, because the child's not going to know the password. But the child just looked at him and then smiled. And I guess it was too much for him because he fired off a couple of rounds. And the other soldiers came, and when they investigated, there was nothing out there. Apparently, he was later disciplined for firing off his weapon, and they subsequently placed him in a mental hospital. I don't know much about it, obviously. It's just what he told me later. This is a camp in the 1950, I think 1953 or something like that, also in Kangwon Doe area. And this is about Sergeant Shin. Sergeant Shin had a senior in the military, and this supposedly takes place in the 1990s. And he later talked about it when he ETS'd or shaday'd, when he finished his military service. And he remembered that one of his superiors had a girlfriend in the village. And whenever he got time, he would go out and see her, and things happened. And when it was time for him to get ready to ETS, he had like 2-3 months. He decided to break up with her. But instead of being, a real man about it, he sent her a letter and said, I wanted to break up with you. He didn't know that she was pregnant at the time. And so she never answered him back. And in despair, she went out and she disappeared. And for maybe a month or 2 weeks, something like that, nobody saw her. And then they discovered her up on the hillside. She had hanged herself. Oh, I'm sorry. Can't see me. Okay.
But they can see your forehead.
That's good. That's nice. It's probably the best thing to look at. I would prefer that. So instead of meeting her in person, he broke up with her and she hanged herself. Afterwards, that camp started to experience a lot of problems. Accidents began to happen. People began to see a female figure. Shin and another soldier were standing in front of the gate guard, or standing guard at the gate. And they saw a woman across the street from them beckon her. And Shin was getting ready to go, but his friend grabbed him and said, no, don't go. If you go, you never answer a beckon like that. If you follow a ghost, you too will die. And so one night, one guard did follow her, and he ended up being hit by a truck as he crossed the street. A couple of days later, 2 soldiers committed suicide in the latrine, which is the bathroom on base. Nobody could figure it out, but the commander was convinced that something was wrong. And so they held a ceremony, and I guess it alleviated the despair that was hanging over the base. But every year on May 10th, they held that same ceremony. And after that, the spirit seems to have been appeased. Graves on bases. I've served on many bases in Korea, and they all have graves. And to be out there next to one of those graves at night, it's not the most comforting feeling. One soldier in the middle of December 1999 was assigned to guard a post near the rear of his base. And he recalled that there were 2 graves there. And he said the post was his guard post was extremely scary. And every night, 2 ghosts would appear. The least scariest ghost was that of a man. And the man would come up to the guards and look at them in the face, smile, and then disappear. And the second ghost, which was the scariest, and this is the one that bothers me the most, I don't know why, but I can really somehow imagine it, was the ghost of a small child. And the child would roam around the base, sometimes flying, looking for its mother. And all you could hear was just a strange whistling sound. What made the child even more terrifying was that nobody ever saw the child's feet. It was like the feet didn't exist. This soldier said that every year his commander would also offer a ceremony to appease the spirits, but it didn't work. And when he finally ETS'd or chaded or finished his military service, he said his hair was completely white from standing guard duty. Who knows? This is Yongsan. Not all of the bases that are haunted are Korean. Yongsan is supposedly, or was supposedly haunted, the South Post. It was said to be a prison or a crematorium, and soldiers on duty there at night would often hear people or something walking down the hallways. Papers would rustle. And Yongsan wasn't the only base. I remember Camp Colburn was supposedly haunted. People out at night along the perimeter would see a Japanese soldier walking up and down, but when they drew close to him, he would disappear. To me, it seems kind of strange considering that all the graves on base were Korean. Why were none of the ghosts Korean? And diplomats and expats. Since the beginning of the Western community in Korea, we have had experiences with ghosts. This picture is the American legation about 1885, 1884. I think that's a Foot there, and I don't know who the naval officer is. You can see some of the first jinrickshas in Korea. Foot's wife, Rose, used to talk about digging up bones in the garden, human bones, and that the walls still had the spirits and shadows of people who had been killed during the 1882 unrest. Mollendorf's house, when he was actually the first Westerner to be living here. His house, let me requalify that. He was the first Western advisor here. There were the missionaries, the French before that, but he's the first Western advisor here. His house was said to be haunted, but he didn't care. He got it for cheap. Horace Allen, same thing. His house was also said to be haunted, and he actually enjoyed the ideal that his house was haunted because he got it for a very cheap price. Many of the missionaries' homes were that way. Even now, some of our expat community live in haunted places, or so they say. those who know the individual know that supposedly a resident in his house committed suicide 100 years ago. Um, Another one of our expat community has a ghost in their house that rattles papers around, seems to have a, a particular interest in papers. Uh, I've been in the 2010s, maybe a decade ago, I used to hang out with some of the diplomatic community near Hanamdong. And one night, a member of the EU told me that she and her husband were in their kitchen when a large pot floated in the air across the kitchen and into the other room. Another diplomat had a ghost chaser inside, or a ghost catcher, I'm sorry, ghost catcher in his house because he was convinced his house was haunted. They're out there, at least to some of the diplomats. Here we have a member of RAS. I don't know if everybody recognizes him or not. This is Tom Coiner on moving day. And I used to always remember people complained about when you'd move into a new house or into a new residence for you, that the house was always dirty. Some people even took the light bulbs. And Westerners were always complaining about why would people leave their houses in this way? And it's actually because you don't want to let the household spirits know that you're moving, because they don't want you to move. You're supposed to be under their domain all the time. So you have these son omnanals, the days without the ghosts, without the spirits. And those are the days that you move. On Cheju, it's a little bit different. You have Shin Gugun, which is about a week. It's the period in between the old and the new. And everybody moves during this period. Kind of makes sense because it's during the winter time. And so it probably cut down on the spread of diseases and stuff. It's on this one period that all of the gods, all of the spirits are away and people can move without them knowing about it. This is another old member of RAS. This is Fred Dustin, 1957 at Chungan University. He was an English teacher then. And the reason why I have this picture up here is because of the desk. Sometimes when you moved, you didn't take everything with you. Sometimes you left behind memories. In 1994, supposedly again, a student told his tutor about when he and his family first moved into the house. And the boy, middle school boy, Chung-il, his sister was in high school. And so the family was kind of happy to be moving into this house. It was kind of an old Korean house, not a hanok, but the old style houses, 70s, 80s houses. And they took everything except for a desk. And the family was kind of happy that this desk was left behind because it was perfect for the older girl, the sister, because then she could study. But every day that she studied, she felt weaker and weaker and weaker. And her shoulders started to hurt. And so she started complaining about it all the time. And mom took her to the doctor, and the doctor couldn't find anything wrong with her. And so mom took her to a mudang, a shaman. And the shaman told her, it's nothing. Don't worry about it. And then when the girl left, the shaman called mom back and said, I want you to take a picture of the girl while she's studying, but don't let her know that you're taking a picture of her. And so that night, mom went home and the girl was studying. And Mom snuck up behind her and she took a picture of her. And when they developed it, they could see that on her shoulders were 2 feet, that the girl before her had committed suicide in her room because the stress of the classes had been too much, and she had hanged herself. And so she was stabilizing herself on the girl's shoulders. I don't know what they did to get away. The tutor never finished the story, so I have no idea how they solved that problem. Not everything was taken away, and not everything was left. This story was told to me, I think, 2002, 2003, by one of my friends. And it happened to his friend, and you know how these go. His friend was in his late 20s, and he was gay, and he had recently broke up with his boyfriend, and he was living in Seoul, and he decided to return back to Daegu, where he had gone to school. And I guess the breakup had come about rather abruptly. And so all he had was his bag and some clothes in it. And he went down to Daegu and he went to a Pudongsan, real estate agent. And they managed to find a room, like a one-room house or one-room place. And he liked it. It was kind of clean. It was surprisingly. It had all the light bulbs, really surprisingly. And he paid 3 million won down as his chonsei, which at that time was fairly expensive, or not really expensive, but for a young man, it was kind of high. And that was probably about $2,000. And that night he moved in, no bedding, no nothing. He used his bag as his pillow and some clothes he threw on the floor, and he fell asleep. And it was in the morning, 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. He woke up, light was still on, and he saw a black shadow move across the wall, even though he's the only person in there. And the black shadow moved across the wall and then out the door. I didn't think much about it. He was tired. He must be crazy or something. So the next night, he's got some blankets. He bought some of those, set them down. He falls asleep. And just as he drifts off, he sees something darker than the darkness around him. And it kind of creeps up to him. And he feels something touching him. Almost caressing him, caressing his neck, moving down his chest, almost lovingly. And then it stopped. And nothing happened the rest of the night. The next night, it happened again. But it's progressing a little bit more. The touching is becoming more intimate. And for some reason, he doesn't feel that it's a woman. It feels like it's a man. And it gets to the point where it's no longer caressing, it's actually molestation. And he doesn't really say how far it goes, but it goes to a point where he feels raped. And so no longer would he stay in the house during the nighttime. He starts sleeping at a sauna and coming back during the daytime. And he goes to the real estate agent and he tells the real estate agent about, everything that's going on. And the real estate agent naturally blows him off and says, you're crazy. And he starts to look at his neighbors' houses, his neighbors' doors, the next door neighbors. And every one of the doors has garbage and dirt and dust piled up. Only his room has no dust in front of it. And one day he actually sees one of his neighbors, and when he goes to talk to him, The neighbor quickly shuts the door and refuses to answer it. Gets to the point where he couldn't stay there any longer, and he gave up his money and moved out. And according to him, it was the best thing he could do because he felt that the entity or whatever it was in the room with him was going to get more and more violent. He lost his 3 million won, and according to him, through my friend, of course, he was rendered impotent from these ghostly molestations. And at the bottom, you can see my pumpkin. My pumpkin comes from my own story. Maybe 15 years ago, 12 years ago, I was feeling homesick. And in my neighborhood, I live on the first floor of a residential area. And in the house in front of me, the next yard over, there was an old grandmother, I don't know, 65, sorry, Steve, 75, an elderly woman. And she wasn't quite there. And she would wander the neighborhood at night. And I like to write at night. And so I would sit there and write. And I had 2 dogs, and both dogs would suddenly stop and look up at the window. And when I looked at the window, there was grandmother's face pressed up against the glass, just looking at me. Scared me to death. And she would do this constantly. One night, out of homesickness, and it was almost Halloween, I carved a pumpkin and set the jack-o'-lantern in front of my door. And I didn't think anything about it. I just had a candle in it and I let it burn throughout the night, or so I thought I was going to do. It was about 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the morning. Suddenly there's pounding at my door. It's the police. They want to know what the jack-o'-lantern is doing because they were unfamiliar with jack-o'-lanterns. Apparently, this grandmother had gone to the police station and reported tokebi, or goblins, being in front of my house. And so they came to investigate. It was the most perfect thing in the world because every time that grandmother started to bother me, I would go and get another pumpkin and carve it and put a candle in it and keep her away. It worked. Incidentally, her son was chief of police, so it wasn't a good idea to get on his bad side. The call of nature and ghost. We've all heard it. Do you want the red toilet paper? Do you want the blue toilet paper? The toilet paper is not the issue. The issue is whether you knock or not. And I love this photograph, this picture. This picture is from my neighborhood. The bar that I used to go to still has this type of bathroom. And I asked the owner if I could use a picture of his toilet in my articles. He kind of likes it. He actually took the article and he has it up on his wall. This is the old style Korean toilets. For people who have been here for a while, we all remember these fairly well. The ideal is ghost and how we deal with them still exists. This is the Chukshin. Chukshin's the outhouse deity. And she's the one that prowls in the bathroom. She's most powerful on days that end with 6. If you don't knock on the door, a long time ago, they would clear their throats 3 times. But if you don't knock on that door 2 or 3 times to announce that you're coming, you'll frighten her and she'll get revenge. That long hair that she has, she'll go to the top of the ceiling and she'll drape it over your head or over your neck or over your shoulders. And she'll give you a disease that none of the shamans can cure. She's especially spiteful to children because the legend was that she was defeated or caused to commit suicide by the acts of a child. And it's a long story, the shamanism, and there are stories from Jeju and the mainland. They're interesting stories, but just suffice to say, you do not want this woman angry at you. As I said, she's extremely powerful on days that end with 6. Sometimes people leave small offerings to her of rice cakes. Any mishaps that occur in the bathroom or near the bathroom are because of her. There was a guy on Jeju who recalled that his sister on Jeju, they often had the pig pens or pigsties. Everybody's heard of dongtaeji, I'm sure. And the pigsties were directly below the bathrooms or the outhouses so that the pigs could eat the feces. He recalled that his sister was afraid to go into the barn where the outhouse was because she could see the Chukshen, the outhouse deity. She would float around in the corners and just watch her, stopping and staring at her. And if the girl tried to go elsewhere, she would follow her along the ceiling. And so she wouldn't go to the bathroom by herself. This you're probably familiar with. This is the honey pots, the old night soil collection. This is, I think, 1950, 52, 53 picture. Not all ghosts in the bathroom were the Chukshen. There's a story about an elderly widow. She moved into a new house, not a new house, but she moved to a different residence. And it was, again, a Korean style home, one of the older ones, 60s. And in those days, you had the courtyard, and then around the house, you had this large cinder block fence covered over with concrete. And on the top, they often put pieces of broken bottles to keep thieves from coming over. And the outhouse was always up next to the front gate, to the left or right of it. That way it's far away from the kitchen area and, it's healthier. And the first night that she moved in, she was tired. She went right to bed. And it was early in the morning that she could hear a child crying. Some little kid, 2, 3, 4 years old, just whining and moaning for mom. And so, she's new to the neighborhood. It's got to be one of the neighborhood kids. And so the next day when she woke up, she went around exploring the neighborhood. But there weren't any children of that age in her neighborhood. And so she kind of puzzled on what had happened. She returned home. And that night, just as she was falling asleep, again, she heard the crying of the child. And she looked up, and in the doorway was a small child, dripping wet, looking at her. And he beckoned her. And so she got up and asked the child, "Where are you from? What's your name? How old are you?" And as she drew near him, he suddenly turned and ran away. And he ran out to the outhouse. And as soon as he entered the outhouse, he started screaming and screaming and screaming. And when she went and opened the door, there was nothing there. The next day, she walked around and she asked her neighbors, "What's the history behind this?" And supposedly, 2, 3 years earlier, there was a young mother there with her child. And the child ended up missing. And they searched for the child, but they never found the child. And the mother, in grief, moved away. And that's how this elderly widow managed to move in. And the widow was convinced that there was something more to this outhouse. And so she had the outhouse, the sewage, pumped out of it. And at the bottom of the septic tank or the sewage tank, or I don't know what you would call it, they found the body of the child. Evidently, the child had fallen into the outhouse, or perhaps some other more nefarious event had happened. But after the child was removed and a ceremony was held to appease the spirits, that very next night, the child appeared at the door again, and he smiled at the grandmother and then disappeared. Not all children started off as living per se. Here I have ghost children created by society. This is a picture from 1953. It's a VD clinic. You can see it's, I guess, maternity ward too, and this doctor does everything. Women in the 1950s, 1960s, society frowned upon women having relationships outside of marriage, obviously. And to have a child in a relationship like this with no known father was just totally unacceptable. So a lot of women, or I shouldn't say a lot of women, some women claimed that they had been raped by a ghost. And these children became known as ghost children. Perhaps that child that had been in the previous story in the outhouse, maybe that child was an unwanted child because there's no mention of the father in it. Obviously, I was in Wonju, so there's going to be a lot of Wonju, Kangwon Doe stories. And in the 80s, I think this is 87, 88, 80, 89. When I was in Wonju, amongst my friends, boys did not associate with girls. It just, you did it on the sly. Mothers would tell their sons all the time, you graduate from high school, then you go to university, you graduate from university, and then you get a good job, then you start thinking about women. And so the mixture of sexes wasn't really encouraged. And this story supposedly takes place here in Seoul, and I've heard many variations of this story. But 5 couples, and I'm not going to mention the university because I don't want to be sued, but 5 couples want to get out of Seoul and away from the disapproving glares of their seniors and their peers. You know, peers are jealous. And so they get on a bus and they head to Soraksan in Kangwon Doe. And it's in the fall, and they get to the mountain. And back then in the 80s, Soraksan wasn't like it is now. Now it's pretty easy to get up and down. Everything's nice and modernized. Here it was on the rugged times. Even in Yogwans and Yoinsoks. I remember one night I was at a Yogwan with some of my Korean friends. We were traveling around, and the police actually came and knocked on the door and wanted to see everybody's ID. And we're all guys, and they want to see everybody's IDs. They went to every door and knocked, checking everybody's IDs. So these guys go out to Soraksan, and they start up the mountain, and it's starting to rain. And one of the girls, we're not going to give real names here, one of the girls, we'll call her Kyunghee, and her boyfriend, we'll call him Choisu. They were going up the mountain, and Kyunghee slipped and fell. And so she hurt her leg. And she told the others, I don't think I can go up. And so they saw one of these small little huts over on the side, maybe Sanshin's, I don't know, whatever. One of the little huts. And they said, okay, we'll put you in here. And when we go to the top of the mountain, we come back down, we'll pick you up then. And she had her favorite book or her magazine, whatever. And so she's in the little building and she waits throughout the day for them. And 5 o'clock rolls around and they still haven't returned. And it's starting to really get dark and it's still raining. 6 o'clock rolls around and they're still not there. Nobody's got cell phones back then. We didn't even have hochugis, the beepies. None of those existed back then. So there was no way in contacting them. 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, no sound. Nobody's there. And then suddenly, there's a knock at the door. And when she opens the door, she sees 8 of her friends. They're all dirty, they're wet, grimy. And one of them's missing, Choisu. Choisu's not there. And so she's, where's Choisu? And they come in and they tell her, Choisu's dead. When we're up on the mountain, he slipped and he fell. And we went down to try to get him, but he was already dead. There's nothing we couldn't carry him back up. So in the morning, we got to go down and we have to tell the police that he's dead so they can come up and get him. And she's ripped apart. She's crying and sobbing, and they're trying to console her. And about 15 minutes later, there's a small tap on the window. And when she looks towards the window, it's Choisu. And his face is all wet and grimy and it's cut up and bloody. And he beckons to her. And she looks at him and she looks at her friends, and her friends tell her, don't go. If you follow a ghost, you will die. But love, she can't bear to be without him. And so she runs to the door and she opens it. And her hand is grabbed and it's Choisu, and he's pulling her out into the forest. And as he gets out there with her, he turns to her and says, they're all dead. They fell from the mountain. He was the only living one. Children. I love this picture of these little kids. This is probably 1890, something like that. Cute little kids. Everybody liked children. Koreans were extremely, it's one thing that the foreigners all said about Koreans were they obviously loved their children. But the child mortality rate in Korea at that time was extremely high. Horace Allen said about 50% of the children died before the age of 5. Smallpox was one of the worst diseases to take children. In fact, you didn't even name the children until they had already managed to survive their bout with smallpox. It was horrendous. Mothers and grandmothers would carry children through the streets, children badly infested, badly infected with the disease. And they would speak to them softly, and they would use honorifics because they were trying to appease Mama, the smallpox god, hoping that the god would leave the children. Didn't always do so. This right here, this picture here is of a body wrapped in straw, often for smallpox victims, especially children. They would wrap them in straw and leave them in the tree, or they would put them under stones The idea was to leave them in the trees so that they would dry out, and that way the smallpox wouldn't spread. This story too, once again, Kangwon Doe. In the fall of 1989, 3 men were hiking in the mountains, and they kind of got lost. They thought they knew where they were going, but they got lost. And it's starting to get dark, and so they say, let's pitch our tents. And they pitch the tent, and they bed down for the night. And the guy closest to the tent opening in the middle of the night wakes up. He feels something like pawing at his hand. And he thinks, it's one of my friends, somebody's trying to, prank me out. But the hand keeps pawing at him and is getting more persistent. And it's icy cold. And it's extremely small. And so he starts complaining to his friends, what are you guys doing? Knock it off. And they wake up and they're, what are you talking about? And he tells them, and they all tell him, oh man, you're having a bad dream. So they switch positions. And I guess this guy was a judo sunso or judo star. And he's now next to the door. And they settle down and they start to sleep. And he feels something on his leg, icy cold. And it's starting to pull him. He's a big man. And it's going to pull him out of the tent. So he starts screaming. Now no one can deny that there's something there. And they look down and they can see like a hand of some sort, a dry hand, really, really small hand. And so they scoot to the very back of the tent, screaming and yelling. And the hand withdraws. About that time, they hear a rooster crowing in the distance. And a rooster's crow, back in the 19th century, according to George Heber Jones, the rooster's crow could dispel ghosts and evil. And so many travelers would not travel until they heard that rooster's crow, because they knew it was safe to actually go out and start traipsing through the woods. Of course, you had to worry about tigers and wolves, but at least they could be killed. In the morning, once the sun finally comes up, they get the guts to go out of the tent, and they see in the distance an old ginseng, mountain ginseng gatherer, and they yell at him. And when he looks at them, he quickly runs away. And so they immediately start to pack up their gear. And they're surprised when an old woman comes up to them. And she asks, "What are you doing here?" And they explain to her, we got lost last night, and so we set up our tent. And she points to a pile of stones. Agijang. Never set up next to an agijang. Never set up next to the graves of a child. And once they realized that, they quickly made their way out of the area and never came back. They were convinced that they had just encountered a ghost earlier. They are not the only ones. A friend of mine, hunting and fishing guide, actually a fishing guide, often goes fishing in Wanju area. And he said one night when he was out, he suddenly got a strange feeling, a cold feeling. And looking around, everything kind of seemed like a little bluish tinge to it. So he went back to his car and he slept in the car. And in the morning when he got up, he went and looked around the camp area that he was at, and he found an unmarked child's grave, a small mound of stones. And he says that he still goes fishing there, or at least he did a couple of years ago. But every time he goes there, he speaks quietly to the spirit, hoping that it will appease it and it will leave him unmolested. So far, it's worked. If the children survived the disease, they had to survive other things, such as Gumiho. Gumiho is the fox with the 9 tails that can transform itself into a woman. And supposedly, this fox, this Gumiho, can live for 100 years. But if it manages to kill and devour the liver of 100 men, it lives on forever. And you see all the geomancers, because of this pearl in this Gumiho's mouth, that if you can possess it and look at the ground and look at the heavens, then you'll have knowledge over both. But most time people fail and they only look at the ground, and those are the people who become geomancers. Not all of the Gumiho were women either. There are a number of tales of men as Gumihos. One of my favorite stories about a Gumiho is a story that appeared in the United States about 1918, probably picked up from Soul Press. I don't know now because Soul Press's archives were destroyed in the 60s by fire. But in 1918, some of the newspapers in the United States were reporting about a strange woman in Korea, an elderly woman, who would wander through the countryside and approach small children and tell them that she could foretell their future by licking their hands. And any time that she managed to convince a child to let her lick their hands, the child would soon die afterwards. So mothers throughout the country were supposedly locking their gates and keeping their children close by. And it's kind of an easy story to kind of like laugh about because it happened a long time ago, 100 years ago. But Gumiho have been believed quite recently. I talked to a woman a couple of years ago, and she said that in the 1980s, she remembered when she was living in Gumi City. What a name, huh? When she was living in Gumi City, there were stories of a woman going around that area, and that was supposedly a Gumiho, and she would attack children wearing red or yellow. And so this one woman, the woman that was telling me the story, said that in the mid 1980s, her family moved from Gumi to Seoul. And she was very, very happy to be out of that city because, you know, Gumi and Gumiho. But when she got to Seoul, Seoul was terrified of a Gumiho that was supposedly roaming through its streets. Donghua Ilbo in September 1984 reported about this mania going through the city. People were calling the news and asking if there was really a Gumiho because children were afraid to wander the streets. Supposedly, a fox had escaped from the grandchildren's park, and people thought it was the fox and that the fox was actually a Gumiho. And so these stories, they aren't just from the past, they're also from the near future. Another near future story is Hong Kong Grandma. And I like this picture. This poor, it's probably a soldier, I believe. This is Jeju Island. This is in the 19 late 50s, early 60s. Grandmother doesn't seem to be too happy with him hunting. Hong Kong Grandmother started in the late 1980s, probably early 90s. And the story says that there was a grandmother who loved cats. And she got on an airplane with one of her cats and flew to Hong Kong. And when the airplane was landing in Hong Kong, it was involved in an accident and everybody was killed, including grandmother and her cat. and her spirit and the cat's spirit were mixed, and they combined, and she returned to Korea. And so she would prowl the streets of Seoul, in Korea and other cities, I guess, and she would ask children questions, and if they couldn't answer, she would ask to see their fingernails, and when they showed her the fingernails, she would kill them. And a woman that I heard who lived through this period, she remembered being a kid in the 80s, late 80s. She said that at night when she would go to sleep, she was always careful to tuck her hands under her pillow so that if the Hong Kong grandmother crept into her room, she wouldn't be able to see her fingernails. I think I had somebody explain it to me that the Hong Kong grandmother started as a kind of like a protest against the rich people, because at this time people were starting to get passports and be able to fly to different places. Prior to 1988, it was very difficult to get passports. And so a lot of people were starting to travel now, but only the rich could really travel. And Hong Kong was a popular destination. Another friend told me that during this period in Cholado, there were a lot of child kidnappings, napchis, and that the children were being taken and used on salt plants or salt fields and on fishing boats. And maybe it was a warning given by parents to scare their children not to stray too far. I have at the bottom, ghosts are a mother's best tool. In my neighborhood a long time ago, I asked a small little boy, his mother was behind him. I asked him, do you believe in ghosts? And the little boy looked at me and he said, yes. In my house, we have a ghost. And I was like, really? Tell me more about it. And he told me that in his house, the ghost hid in the refrigerator. And if he opened up the refrigerator without his mother, the ghost would grab him and eat him. And his mother had that look on her face like, but it worked. I guess he didn't open that refrigerator very often. One of the most feared ghosts, and it's not just children who had things to worry about. One of the most feared ghosts was Sangakshi. And I've heard that this goes back to Tanjong and his wife, maybe. But she's the ghost that's filled with Han, the hatred and revenge because of her unfulfilled destiny, motherhood. She never got to become a mother. And these virgin women, unmarried women, when they died, were often buried in graves at crossroads so that the footsteps of men could keep them pounded down so they couldn't wander around the countryside and exact revenge. That's the stories of the past. These female ghosts, these virgin ghosts, supposedly had immense sexual appetites. They haunted areas like here, Chongno. The sight of a male sexual organ either appeased them or angered them. If you look on Kangwon Doe over on the East Coast, there are many, many little shrines with male organs in them, supposedly to appease the female spirits. There's even a penis park on the East Coast. These ghosts were frequently encountered by soldiers and members of the National Assembly. In 2008, if you look at the National Assembly, it kind of looks like a hearse, the old hearse in the Chosun period. And the legend was that this area was once a cemetery for palace women. And so members of the National Assembly at night, when they were working, were supposedly being molested by these spirits. And so something had to be done. And in 2008, I apologize for the picture. I got this picture many, many years ago off the internet, and so I have no idea who the original owner is. But they erected this giant phallic-shaped stone. I think it cost something like $87,000 to erect. And by having this stone here, it was believed that it would stop these ghostly molestations. But the Christian members of the National Assembly weren't exactly pleased with it. And on May 23rd, 2009, they had the stone removed and a tree was planted instead. Because we don't need that in this present age. The haunted skies. No names for here. We won't identify any of these Korean airlines, these international airlines, but considering the period, it should be pretty easy to figure out what airlines we're talking about. One airline in 2003, 2004, one of the flight attendants committed suicide at home. And according to one of the crew members who I talked to, she said that in the crew bunker, the place that she used to sleep at, no matter how many times you close the curtain on her bunk, within a few minutes, it was wide open again. And it didn't matter how many times you did it, it always opened again. All the other ones would stay closed. Only that one would stay open. Perhaps the most infamous case was on another airline, flying from Sydney to Incheon, when we have Miss Pak. She committed suicide in the bathroom. She hung herself with her own scarf in the bathroom. And the flight crew at that time kind of kept it secret. They didn't let anybody else on the plane know it at that time until they landed. They didn't want to create panic aboard the airplane. And we know that people do die on airplanes and stuff. But over the next couple of months, strange things began to happen on this airplane, especially if it was the same crew that was on Mrs. Pak's flight. One crew member said that when they were in the bunker area, they felt something put a blanket over them. And when they looked, there was a hand passing through the wall. Another one said that the smoke alarm in the bathroom where she had committed suicide kept going off. No matter how many times they checked it and repaired it, every time they were in the air, that the smoke alarm in that bathroom would go off. And perhaps the scariest one was in first class, when a sunnim, a monk, Buddhist monk, was the only passenger in that first class section, and suddenly started chanting, or I don't know, praying. And the flight attendant asked him, "What are you doing?" And he pointed to every chair and he said, "There's a dead person in every chair." And after that, the crew was going crazy. And it made it into the newspapers. I think it was Chosun Ilbo. And Chosun Ilbo interviewed the company and asked the company for an explanation. And I don't think the company's explanation really was comforting. They said it's possible that working in a closed space for extended periods leads them, the crew, to overreact and sends their imaginations into overdrive. I don't think I want my air crew to be seeing ghosts and having their imagination going into overdrive. Supposedly, this airplane was then taken off and retired for a certain period of time. And then 2 or 3 years later, reintroduced with a new number. And shortly afterwards, another woman committed suicide in that airplane's bathroom with a scarf. Now, when I first heard these stories, I could not believe that somebody could hang themselves in a bathroom with a scarf. You would be surprised how many times it's happened. There was a, I don't have the, I don't have the, I don't have the paper with me right now, but people flying from Beijing to Incheon have killed themselves, hanged themselves with belts. Flying from Hong Kong to here, people have committed suicide. If you do an internet check, you can find various cases of people committing suicide in flight by hanging themselves, all within the recent years. This story, Naengmyeon and Ghost, Dick Underwood from the Underwood family. I was kind of surprised when he told me this story. This story supposedly was from his mother about 1916. He said his mother was on one of the streetcars near Sodaemun, and there was a delivery boy with naengmyeon, and suddenly he jumped right in front of the trolley or the streetcar, and he was so close, and all of a sudden they heard a crash and kind of like felt a disturbance as the trolley went over something, and she was convinced that the boy was dead, but he wasn't. He had dropped all that naengmyeon in the tray and everything, and this trolley had run over it, and he was angry that his naengmyeon was all upset. But the reason why he had done it was he was convinced he was being followed by ghosts. And so he thought that if he could just jump in front of it, the trolley would snag this ghost and take the ghost away from his life. It still happened in the 60s. I've had more than a few people tell me that while they were at the hotel, they looked down into the traffic and they would see people darting in and out of the traffic, almost getting hit by cars because they were trying to have the cars exorcise these ghosts from their lives. Buses. Haunted buses. I hate taking buses. It's the worst thing in the world, especially now, coronavirus. Anybody who knows me knows that I do not like public transportation. Give me my bike. I'm all happy. In the 1980s, and I was looking at my notes earlier, it says 1986, but I think it was a little bit later. I think it's during the Han River miracle. There was a businessman. Back then, I don't know if the curfew was in place or not, but there was a businessman, and he had been out drinking heavily, and you had to get back in time before the curfew. And so he boards this bus near Chono Bridge, and he boards the bus, and he gets on, he pays his fare, and he's looking around, and the bus driver seems to be crying. And he looks at the passengers, and all of the passengers are weeping. And so he sits down on his position, and he's really unnerved. Everybody seems to be crying. So just before he gets to the bridge, he gets off the bus and figures, I'll just go sleep it off along the river. And in the morning, when he gets up, goes and buys a newspaper, and he discovers that the bus had gone over the bridge and everybody on the bus was dead. And it sounds like a great story, especially when the person telling the story wrote about it just 2 weeks after, I can't remember the name of the bridge, the bridge that collapsed in 1990 something. One of the bridges collapsed. But what's the real? Okay. But what's the real story behind this? I'm not really quite sure, but checking all the internet and the newspapers and stuff, closest story to this I could find was bus 572 in 1988. It went over the bridge. They said it was a retread problem and excessive speed. And it went over the bridge, crossed over the meridian, went over the side of the bridge. 19 out of 35, 19 people killed, 35 injured. Many of the people had their legs amputated from the impact when the bus hit the river. I see the notes, so I got to hurry. I prefer bicycling along the Han River. This is the Han River. It's beautiful. It's fantastic. It's dynamic. And according to some people, it's dangerous. It's haunted. Bong Joon-ho, the director of The Host, claims that his movie, The Host, a great movie, was inspired partially from his experience during high school when he looked out on the river and saw something moving, some creature. And there's 1928, for some reason, the newspapers reported that there was a monster of some sort, 2 meters long, spotted swimming in the river. I think carp are about 2 meters long. Not all of these little monuments out here are exactly scary and evil. This one is near Hangju Bridge, across from the Hangju Fortress. And it's about 2 brothers, and you can see my bike right here. I take lots of pictures of my bike. These are 2 brothers out here on the river. Supposedly, they had found gold. And as they were crossing the river, one of the brothers heard or felt this voice compelling him to kill his brother and to take his gold. Why share? It almost sounds like Lord of the Rings and Smeagol. But instead of killing his brother, he takes his gold and he throws it in the river. And he tells his brother about it, and his brother does the same thing. They both throw their gold in the river. So if you're ever out there scuba diving, you might want to look for the gold. There are other stories. This one is not too far from Hangzhou. This is near Nanji. And they say at night, sometimes, and who they are, a few people, you can hear a woman screaming. And there's a reason behind this woman screaming. And for me, it kind of has an impact on me, because in the mid 1990s, Sampung Pekwajam collapsed. And I lost one of my friends in Sampung Pekwajam. He had just started working there like 2 weeks earlier. And they didn't find his body for quite some time. Nanji, prior to it being this park, used to be the dump. And they say that a lot of the rubble from Sampung Pekwajam was taken and placed in this dump, and not all of the bodies were recovered. And perhaps one of these bodies is seeking its release. Half basement apartment. The half basement apartment is also in this area. About 2003, 2002, it was in the newspapers that anybody living in this half basement apartment over the last 10 years had suffered a lot of mishaps. Some people died, some people, their companies went bankrupt, others had traffic accidents. When they were remodeling, and in the area, people used to see a woman's ghost. When they were remodeling the building, they found in one wall half of the woman, and in the other wall the other half of the woman. Somebody had murdered her and placed her into the concrete. And the suitcase near Nanji, near the World Cup Stadium, there's a tunnel there. And on the top of that tunnel, there was a suitcase. And when they opened it, there was a body found inside. This is the flood monument. Once again, my bicycle. And before Mapo Bridge, we had another suicide bridge. In fact, that monument is not only for the construction of the bridge and the people who died building it, but also for the large number of people who committed suicide. This footbridge here was a very popular spot. According to Dongan Ilbo in 1928, 150 people died in the river in a 42-month period. Some of them drowned, and a lot of them were suicides. Most of these suicides were just small blurps in the newspaper. Some kind of attracted more attention, such as No Byung-un, 28-year-old doctor who had a mistress who was a waitress, a 20-year-old girl. And the scandal got out. The girl committed suicide first, and No followed her the next day. Time's up.
Yeah, we're
All right. Well, I guess that's it.
stay seated there. Let's try and share this. We're running close, but we still have some time for questions. Just if you have a question for Robert, just go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
No questions.
You're all perfectly satisfied with the presentation.
I have a question.
Okay, go ahead.
Really great talk, thank you. Is there a kind of a ghost hunting culture here in Korea, like there is, say, like in the UK or in North America?
Yeah, I haven't been to any of them. About 8-9 years ago, it was really, really popular in Korea. People would go out on it. I think a few people in our community go out and do these ghost hunts. You might want to check with Dark Side of Soul. They might be able to put you in touch with some of them. I haven't been on any of them. It's really hard to figure out.
It's hard to figure out what we're doing. Yeah, I know.
I'll try a question.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Any stories of ghosts of animals such as a tiger or a bear? I know about the foxes and such, but like a tiger who was killed and its spirit being a ghost, or a bear or any other major animal.
I'm sure that there are, but I haven't bothered with them. It's hard for me to grasp the ghost stories as it is. And
but do you think there are some? You've chanced across them and just didn't read them, or you have never seen such a story?
I'm sure they're out there. I haven't really concentrated on anything like that before. And I'm sure in the old stories, I'm sure that there are some.
I haven't seen one myself. I do not think. I mean, tigers can like spiritually transform, and just like dragons can appear and transform such spiritually, but I haven't heard of, the ghost of a dead tiger who was unhappy about something and haunting a village or a temple. I don't think I've heard such a story. I'm just wondering. All right.
Anybody else? Can you read what's here? Is there a question in those chats at all?
Nope.
Okay,
I have a question. If
go right ahead.
yeah, I'm on Jeju Island, and Halloween's coming up on Saturday. A few days ago, I went to a hackberry trees.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, there are a lot of them on Jeju, and they're connected with shamanism. I didn't go there because of the shamanism. It was just a very eerie forest, and I took some photos. And it's the grove of hackberry trees is surrounded by a graveyard, very old graveyard. And the first tree in there, and the most impressive tree, has a lot of beautiful vines on it. Someone has put the, I don't know what you would call it, but the medicine bottles that flow into the tree
Right.
to keep it alive. That was right there in the center. And my camera is about to die. I have to use it on very low speed. So I was taking photos. It was raining that night. I was taking photos from my car, had my camera braced on the windowsill because I had to shoot at such a low shutter speed. And I took some photos, not knowing how they would turn out. And it got darker and darker and eerier and eerier. And at the very end, I took about five photos on, I don't know what it's called, but press it once and they just,
Oh,
The
flash.
burst.
Yeah.
The burst.
Yeah.
Mm.
because sometimes I get a better focus. One of them will just be a little better. So I took them and I went home. Before I went home, that was the last photos I took, and I had my car parked on the side of the road, but partially on the road, so I had my blinkers on, and I turned my engine off, and my battery is like my camera. It's not that great car battery, speaking here, and I got ready to start my car, and it went boom, boom. And I said, oh my God, I'm up here in the cemetery. It's getting dark, and I'm going to have to call the rescue people, which is embarrassing to begin with. And anyway, I said a little prayer to my own spirits and let it sit for a few minutes to see if the battery would just do it. And it cranked over once and it hit. So anyway, I was quite happy. I turned around and drove out. As I was driving out, a huge black crow flew in front of my car, right across the windshield. I looked down and my car is a Corando. It has, I don't know what they're called, but coils that have to be heated. And there's a little light there to tell you, wait until the coil is hot enough before you start. And it's never happened before, but my coil on my car was blinking. And I thought, well, something's wrong with my car, but I watched the heat gauge and it seemed okay. And I said just a blinker. But the coil on my car had, the little blinking thing was two elongated eyes with horns on the top.
Oh my God.
So the thing about it is the photos the last photos that I took when I came back and got them in my camera and started to post-process them, the very last photo, there's a picture of Ghost. I don't know why, because these were all taken in burst mode. Nothing was changed. Nothing was on my lens. And the first 3 or 4 are normal. And the very last one, I don't know if you call them ghosts, but maybe wraiths, like spirits that are, anyway, it's there. I can't explain it. So anyway, I'm going back Halloween and it's going to be a full moon. But my question to you is, in Korea, if you are dealing with ghosts and you're dealing with spirits, a lot of times I go to some place that has some kind of spiritual significance, and maybe on Tongji, winter solstice, I'll leave something, just to ask, watch over me throughout the year. But Koreans, if they're dealing with something that's like, I think this grove, the trees were planted when the oldest people buried in these cemeteries, there are 3 of them around it, and one of them is quite old, and you can see it's the main cemetery. So I'm thinking these trees were planted there by, you know, their family. When one person died, they would plant one and plant one and plant one. So this grove of trees are hackberry trees, which even in the West are associated with druids and shamanism. And on Jeju-do particularly, one of the oldest ones was struck by lightning. It was big news here a couple years ago that this big tree had suddenly died. But anyway, my question is, I'm going back on Halloween Eve because there's going to be a full moon. If the weather conditions are right, I might get a shot of full moon through these airy trees, which would be great. But when I go, I'm thinking of taking a little soju and tangerine and whatever is cheap but nice and put it under this main tree that has the medicine going into it. And
You're going to put the alcohol, the full bottle or the empty bottle?
I probably should do, well, normally I think you share it with them. But I've got to drive home, so the bottle will not be emptied. So anyway, my question is, concerning ghosts and spirits, you know, Koreans are big on honoring their ancestors and all, but they're really frightened of ghosts. Do they ever take any kind of offerings to a place where, maybe you mentioned it in your talk, where a ghost would be there and they would like to appease the ghost and the ghost would be happy? I don't want to go there and intrude on the ghost. Of course, Halloween is not big in Korean customs, but you know, I think in the spirit world, they're probably into all the customs. So anyway, what do you think about this? You know, think I'll escape unscathed, or I should?
I think you have an expert on the shrines living on Jeju Island. I can't remember his name right now. Gillespie?
Joey
Joey,
Rositano.
right. Joey Rositano.
I think I've seen some of his articles on the internet.
And I think he has a book out. So
Yeah, and actually there's a documentary I just noticed on shamanism. But I am interested in shamanism, but you know, I have a lot of other things that I'm interested in, and I don't really take the time to really dig into it. It's one of those things, you know, if you were 3 people, wow. But
right.
anyway, what do you know about that?
I don't. The only thing I know is what Fred used to tell me on the island, and I don't think it would help you on it.
Okay, well,
But certainly there's nothing wrong with offering a bottle of soju to the spirits of the tree.
Everybody offers. Yeah.
Yeah, I just don't want to turn around and find one of the descendants there with a sickle coming at me like a Halloween movie or something. Anyway, that's all I wanted to ask. Just
well, thank you very much, folks. Thank you for joining us tonight. I hate to bring this to a close. We've had such an interesting tale of all kinds of stories, which have reminded me of being in Boy Scout camp years ago. We're pleased to announce that we will have our annual holiday book sale on Saturday, November 7th from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. To accommodate social distancing, the sale will not be in our offices, but it will be on the ground floor of this building in the conference room. We're going to be clearing out lots of inventory, and we're going to have books priced at $1,000, $2,000, $5,001, along with some other great bargains. Our next lecture will be by Zoom on Tuesday, November 10th, 7:30 p.m. Dr. Sanko Lewis will reveal to us the secret characteristics that give traditional dance and martial arts their unique Korean flavor. We look forward to seeing you then. Thank you very much. Good night.